But first of all, I want to say thank you to everybody for attending. My name's Manny. I'm one of the organisers at Trusted Tech Talk. So it's just a platform to bring the tech community together, which is just becoming more and more of a need right now, especially with the lack of human contact. And there's not a chance to have a pizza and beer as well. So I hope you've ordered a takeaway and got a beer in hand. But if not, it's not the end of the world. So I'm really happy to host this webinar this evening, which is Migrating to Azure Cloud. Luckily, we've got Lawrence and Rick, who've got a wealth of knowledge in Azure, and they're going to be talking sort of 15-20 minutes each about their experience with Azure Cloud. Lawrence probably more on a macro level, and Richard more into the detail in terms of on the development side. But I know, Lawrence, you've got experience in that as well, so you guys are probably chipping into each other's. I just want to highlight the way the format's going to work is Lawrence is going to talk for about 15-20 minutes. Rick's going to speak for 15-20 minutes. And then there's going to be a 30 to 35 minute Q&A. So we should be wrapped up by sort of 6:45. At the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A section, which you should see. It's just next to the chat function. For any questions that you want to ask for the Q&A stage, if you can just put your questions in there, and the questions that have the most votes on them will be the questions that we'll ask first. So feel free to ask any questions as and when you sort of think of them, and we'll rank them, and then we'll obviously ask them. If the more the crowd want to hear about that, we'll ask those questions first to the panel. So I will first of all pass you on to Lawrence. So Lawrence, if you want to go first, looking forward to this. So yeah, if you kick it off.
No expectation. Okay. My name's Lawrence Lilley. I'm Chief Technology Officer for an organisation called the Mutual Vision. Mutual Vision technologies have been around for since the late 80s. We provide banking software for building societies, and we cover about half the market in the building society sector. So the mutual sector is very important to us. We're actually unique in our sector in that we're owned by some of our customers. So the building societies actually own us as an independent software vendor, which is interesting. The first time I've come across that, but it's definitely a challenge and an opportunity. So, but you don't care about Mutual Vision, so I'll talk about, and you don't really talk about me, but I'm going to talk about me for a while. Just to give you a bit of background. I'm a software engineer by background. Been doing this for a very long time. My engineering days were predominantly in middleware across a range of industries. I did travel, I've done insurance, banking, a lot of stuff in higher education, worked for 3 different universities over the years. So again, there's a lot of different areas there in terms of IT, but principally in what is now known as the API economy, or that kind of area, which is actually very important right now because fintech and the fintech world, especially in finance. So I spent a lot of years introducing agile stuff into organizations. I did my first agile transformation in the year 2000, which tells you how old I am. And I've spent 20 years sort of using these agile tools to get somewhere and to basically provide better solutions for customers. And I learned quite early on that agile is a business thing, not a technology thing. If you have an agile technology department and a non-agile business, there's no point. You want to be, agile is a business philosophy, and the IT department can't do it on their own and shouldn't be. One of the things that drives me crazy is when IT departments talk about the business, like the IT department isn't part of the business. It is, and it's part of the same thing. Then I went into started getting into sort of IT leadership, and I discovered quite amazingly, I'm a bit of an anarchist, in typical software engineering terms. Processes, something gets in my way. Learned that's not correct. I had an epiphany many years ago, where I worked out that process can be my friend and can protect me. So it was a significant mind change moment for me, and it helped me in sort of getting into that management and leadership position. And I'll come back to that in a little while because it's important in terms of the subject for this tech talk. As a leader, I worked out that commerciality matters. It matters. You got to think who's going to buy your stuff. The fact that it's great doesn't matter. The fact that somebody's going to actually use it and want it is the most important thing. Therefore, that goes into numbers. My favourite quote on numbers is by Lord Kelvin, the first Lord Kelvin. If you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. And therefore, you have to measure things. You know, you don't know you're going faster unless you've got a speedo. I also learned about projects versus product. Product matters. Projects, yeah, they're a great way of finding money and for governing money. But in terms of IT, in my opinion, projects are pretty much redundant. Product matters, and that falls into the agile world. So Mutual Vision, I joined Mutual Vision a couple of years ago to look at what it was going to be. Now, Mutual Vision's product set is relatively legacy over the in what we're talking about in terms of cloud terms. So my job was to find out where we want to be in 5 years. Given our environment and what our customers need, that's got to be, and it is, and ended up as a SaaS-based system sat in the public cloud. There's no argument about that, and our customers want it. And interestingly, our regulators want it as well. They can see the value of the stability that the public cloud brings. Again, I'll come back to that in a little while. So, you know, that's a bit of background on me. I'm going to tell you about. So, one thing I got to do is I got a bunch of legacy software I got to move into the cloud now. What can you do? Pick it up and put it in there? You can do that. I can pick up a legacy 3-tier application and move it into the cloud. That's easy. Don't want to do that because it sort of bypasses a lot of the actual technological benefit. So we want to move it. We want to move into the cloud because the world's changed. And the world's changed in the last 10 years. 10 years, I wouldn't necessarily have suggested this, not for a risk-averse market like I'm in. But now, especially over the last year, things have changed. And the expectations of our customers have changed. And frankly, I've got to fulfill those expectations. The expectations of the regulator have changed. Now, as a business, Mutual Vision are not regulated, but all of our customers are. So therefore we are. I spend about 2 to 3 months of my life every year talking to auditors and explaining to them how things work and why they work in a particular way. So the expectations of the auditors and the regulators behind them have changed. So they want us in the cloud, but they want us to be very, very controlled in that world. We want to specifically talk about Azure. We had some choice, and I'm not particularly wedded to any particular technology. One of the reasons we chose Azure, and you've got to look at it in terms of what you need and what you have. So I had a bunch of people who already knew Microsoft products. So Azure seemed like the sensible route to take because I don't need to train everyone in cloud tech. I only need to do half the team. That's a good variable. So I've got staff that are comfortable with that Microsoft tool set. I also have some customers that find AWS, as the other leader in this area, questionable. AWS, I apologize if anybody's on here. Amazon as an organization don't pay their tax. They don't pay what our customers consider a due fare. And if you consider that the building societies are mutual organizations, their primary reason for being is the benefit of their members and the benefit of their communities. And that part of that is, you know, paying your fair due in tax. So there's a couple of things there. So that sort of drew us towards that Microsoft Azure. You know, and other than that, you take the variables you have and you need, and you apply those business variables to yourself. So want to talk about the approach we took. So we want to move all this stuff, and I've got a 27-year-old Oracle product, and I've got to move that into the cloud. That's not an easy thing to do. It's actually 28 years old now. It's not a simple sort of thing to approach. So I want to talk about, and we'll talk about this at the meta level. I want to talk about the technologies. That's cool. But then I want to talk about operational need and financial need, because all of those things, these are all variables that apply to how we do this. So I've got to move all these, that's our core product. It's 27 years old. It's brilliant. It's functionally rich. It looks 27 years old. So need to move that into modern technology. But I also have a bunch of digital products that I also need to move, and they need to follow in. But I'm in a risk-averse sector. So if you think about that, if I was to do a big bang thing, I can go away, spend 3 years, write a brand new system, come on. They don't want to change, because a big bang change like that, they have to report it to the regulator. They have to gain, it takes about a year to agree to change a system like that. So we can't do that, So I'm not doing the big bang approach. Another approach is the wrapper thing, where you start putting things around that core system and building wrappers around. I've got a personal experience of that, and it's not fun. That's simply because you never get back to fixing that middle bit, and then you end up in software you cannot support. So instead, it's what I call the ice cream scoop. So what we're doing is we're taking journey by journey of this big financial system, and we're moving it over into the cloud, section by section, journey by journey, to give value to the customers piece by piece. That involves a whole lot of thinking, because it's not just instantiate a bunch of new functions inside the cloud and play with them. This is, right, well, these things have to combine, and this is hybrid across public and private cloud. So as you can probably guess, that's complicated. It's doable, it's pretty fine, but at least at the end, I need to be able to switch off the old system and it just disappear. I do not want it hanging around. Also, our system's sat in Oracle, and frankly, that's just too big for what we need. We can use, that's a 1990s technology. I do not need it. So how do we do this? I use a metaphor with my staff with regards to, and customers with regards to a picture frame. I said, we're going to move individual bits over into the cloud. Woohoo, that's great. But that can become swiftly chaotic. What you need to do is, it's a jigsaw puzzle. I don't know if anybody, I'm not a great jigsaw puzzle fan, but I like the metaphor, which is, when you do a jigsaw, you do the outside first. You do it all the edges, and then you start building up the internals. You have to do that when you go into the cloud. You have to set up your tenancies correctly. You have to set up your security correctly around the outside, so that anything you do in it is already protected. You don't do this piece by piece. Yeah, you need to get your basic frame without all the internals, and then you can start building that little picture of a waterfall, or a picture of a windmill, whatever it is in your picture frame. Sorry, your jigsaw puzzle. So get your frame done, then start moving stuff in, and that's what we've done. We've taken and we've built a frame to work in, and then we're gradually moving those items over into that sort of safe net. And then, so that's technological. You're talking about the three approaches. We've got an approach, got the metaphor of building those things gradually. But just as a hint, get your tenancy right. You will get it right quickly. Fail fast, simply because it's really hard to get it to retrofit it afterwards, especially when you're running customer systems in this, because they don't want it changed. You only want to change once. I mentioned security. Get your security done. The security it is phenomenal. I sold this to all my customers by simply saying, I don't have sort of 3,000 to 6,000 people permanently looking at cybersecurity. Microsoft do. They spent billions on security. I can't match that in my little world. So I'm going to make good use of their security. But you've got to set it up right. And so that you've got to be able to prove it to the, in my case, to the regulators. I've got to prove that security works, because this is people's financial data. It's people's data. You've got to get that security right. The functions are there, but you've got to set them up. There are also cost implications. I stumbled across something that was quite entertaining, which is we set up a bunch of VLANs to segment things, which is great. Yeah, and then we found out that API management, the lovely tool in Azure, suddenly costs more, because by a factor of 10 or 20, just because to use VLANs with VLANs, you need to get the service level up, and that goes up from $2,000 to 20 grand. So there's a significant impact there. So you need to do your cost modeling. I have this ridiculous spreadsheet of cost where I'm looking at every function I use within Azure, and I'm trying to predict, and I tried to predict how much all those things are going to cost when I put them together. I'll come back to that in a minute. So, when you think about the security developer setup, if you start choosing the developer elements of the functions and things within inside Azure, they're a lot cheaper and they're a lot less robust. And as soon as you put it into a production model, prices go up. So think about it. The other thing is technical diversity. I'm an engineer, I love this stuff. You know, we love putting all these little tools, and it's like you go into the Azure marketplace, it's got 300 new things since last time I looked. And it's like, oh, I could use that, and I could use a bit of that, and I could use a bit of that. There's a problem there though. So it's there, you've got to look at management of technical diversity. I have 10 architectural principles, and that's one of the key ones. I'm not saying that the technology shouldn't be diverse, but manage it. You don't want suddenly 14 different type of databases to look at, because each developer has done their, chosen their favorite, and then somebody leaves and you don't know how to use that function. You need to manage that technical diversity. I'm not precluding using, and there's some fantastic stuff, but just go and look at the data storage mechanisms within Azure, and there's hundreds of them. Manage the diversity, because you've got to be able to support this stuff when it goes live. So work out your approach to moving there if you're migrating. If it's brand new, greenfield, it's up to you, but manage your general approach to that migration. Think about your outside and then start working on the internals. Don't forget the outside. Get your security right, both for a cost thing and then manage that technical diversity. Think about those things. And they're not in a way, they're not technology things, they're process things, they're management things. Okay. Right, so technological. Now I want to talk about operations. So in my environment, I'm the CTO, but I act as the COO as well, because I run dozens of environments for customers, and I look after them. Those production environments are my responsibility. Then we do managed service. So, and when you go into a SaaS environment, you're looking after everyone. So a couple of things you need to think about, and you need to think about them right at the start. One is configuration management. Azure is an intensely configurable thing. Rich will be able to talk about that. It's intensely configurable. And I need to trace every change that happens to an environment at all points. I need to know that I had a situation when we were trying to go live with something, and at some point in the configuration change, there was a misspelled URL. It took me a day to find it. This is not helpful. You need to get your configuration management done. And I know it's a boring ITIL configuration management database thing, but you need to think about it and how you're going to police it. Because the developers will add functionality and add their own settings, let alone the settings that are required by all the services you write. So get it right and think about it actively. And then, of course, you've got to think about dependencies. So what's the dependency of that component on that component? Is it dependent? If it is, if one changes, does the other have to change? Now, you know, loosely coupled stuff, woohoo, but you've got to know what is actually fundamental. If you change your settings of your key vault, it will affect all these other services. So make sure it works before you do it. So that's it. Release sign off. Oh my Lord, this is boring, but I'm sorry. Yeah, you've got to have, you know, all those gates that PMO talk about, they're actually quite important, or very important. You need to be able to flow. Now, pipelines can do that for you, and we've got pipelines set up to, if somebody press a button, it can go straight out. No, can't do that, because there has to be a trail in our world, in the finance world, of when things go live. I watched a fantastic talk by a couple of years ago by AutoTrader, and they said it's brilliant getting to live. We've got a whole DevOps thing. All the developer does is write their new code and press a button and it's live. I can't do that. There's absolutely no way, because when the auditors come and talk to me, they need proof that somebody with the authority to do so released into a particular version at a particular time into a particular environment. If that isn't there, it's a very bad thing. I know it sounds ridiculous, but you need it. So you need to think about, and whatever it is in your context, you need to think about what that release sign-off process is. You need to make it lightweight, but traceable. You need it. And you need to work out if and how you're going to maintain segregation of duties. If in the DevOps world, everybody gets access to everything, is that a good idea? Not particularly, especially if, like me, you're dealing with financial data. And if you're PCI or anything else, you've got to think about segregation of duties and who has access to environments. And that means you need to go back to your tenancy again and how you're doing your tenancies. So segregation of duties, sign off. I know this is boring stuff, but it is actually very important. And configuration management, getting it right, because you do not want this stuff to go wrong when just by the misspelling of a URL. Okay, so operational, it's cool. I'm gonna crack on because I'm running out of time. I'm sorry, God, punch me. Financial, yeah, changing from CapEx to OpEx is a serious thing for any business. We've built ISVs and the internal software as costing capital expenditure. You're moving to OpEx. To do that, you need reporting analytics. So you need to spend time thinking about that reporting and that ability to report on it. You've got to do it on a weekly, monthly basis. You've got to track this stuff so that you can estimate and talk to your finance team. Because if you're starting to rack up value, that's great because you've got more customers, but you need to predict it. And you've got to ensure that also the development, you've got stuff span up in development, you've got to shut it down, save yourself money when it's not being used. UAT environments, why are they running at 12 o'clock at night? You're not using them, so shut them down. So things like that, you've got to start thinking about the money. And I see people are already asking questions about that. But talk to your finance team. They are your friends. They understand this stuff in a way. They don't understand the technology, but they do understand the numbers. And you becoming very pally with them, they can really help you out. You need to do that for your success. Okay, so 3 things. Yeah, what's your technology? What's your operational? What's your financial? There's a bonus one. So the 4th one, which is education. Talk to your teams. Talk to product managers about it. They think they know about what the cloud means and they don't necessarily. Talk to your finance team, talk to your professional services teams. They need to understand it because they're the face of your company, and they will need to use the same language you're using. So that's my sort of highlights of how you should go and approach that at the sort of the meta level. Just so you know, we've completed an integration layer. We've got a whole set of application for a broker portal running in this stuff, merged with that offshore, legacy system. And we're saving money by going to Azure on a bunch of websites, saving those because I'm making good use of the technologies. I've got better security, I've got better fault tolerance, woohoo! And I'm not even starting to use the benefit of the cloud properly yet. That's it.
Brilliant. Cheers, Lawrence. Not too much over there, so yeah, I'm surprised. No, but cheers, Lawrence. Thank you. Richard, moving on to yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Richard Stockley. I started out as a developer 20-something years ago. About 10, 11 years ago, started to pick up the cloud, not literally, obviously, but I've been primarily working in Azure for pretty much the last 10 years since it started, really. And I tend to do contract work. That takes me into a lot of different organizations, and I see lots of different approaches, a lot of approaches that are successful, a lot of approaches that are less successful. And I wanted to kind of cover 3 points today that will help if you are going to adopt or migrate to the cloud, how to help you be successful. I mean, those 3 points are, so I wanted to just go through how I've seen cloud adoption happen quite a few times, how it probably could happen and be a lot better. And that's kind of cloud agnostic, but I'll mention some of the Azure technologies and kind of with an emphasis on Azure, but in theory, that's cloud agnostic. And then the last point really is about embracing change, which is a really big thing around the cloud. So this may resonate with some of you on the meeting today. How cloud adoption often happens. So actually migrating to the cloud is really easy, but it's not always done very well. And that's not usually for technical reasons. Each organization that moves to the cloud needs to have a joined up approach from the organization. So what you tend to find is somebody will come from senior management and say, hey, we're moving to the cloud now. And an IT team will just grab hold of that straight away. They'll start to put that into agile processes. They'll identify either a new solution or an existing solution they're going to move up to the cloud, or new infrastructure or existing infrastructure. And then, of course, the cloud providers make it super easy to do that. So put in your credit card details, probably get some free credits. And then we normally start by doing what we already know. So if we want to host a website, we'll create a VM, we'll put our website up into IIS. If we need a database, we'll spin up a VM, we'll install SQL Server, we'll connect those together. And then, hey, presto, we'll do a demonstration to the business and say, look, here it is running up in the cloud. And the business will then go, great, when's it going live? And that's when some of the more awkward questions start. And the first one is usually, who's going to pay for this? And that usually ends up with the question of, well, how much is it going to cost? And how are we going to charge for this? So are we going to charge back to departments or clients? And then everybody, because it's the cloud, always thinks about security at this point. So we're going to put data up into the cloud. Is that data secure? Have we got sensitive data? Do we need to worry about that horrible four-letter word, GDPR? If we're talking about security, is our infrastructure, is our solution secure? Who can make changes? We've already got an Active Directory with roles and groups defined on premise. We'd like to use the same groups. Can we do that up in the cloud? Well, okay, we'll worry about security, but we get scalability, resilience, recoverability. They're all kind of for free, aren't they? Because we're in the cloud. You know, our data will just be magically backed up, and we can kind of scale up and scale out. And all these questions start to come forward. And of course, these haven't been thought about. And then usually at the very last minute, somebody will go, has anybody spoken to support? And support don't know anything about this. And quite often they don't know anything about the technology either. So who's going to approve changes? How are changes going to be deployed? How are we going to promote changes through environments? Have we established different environments? And you might think, okay, well, this is a really naive, small company problem. But actually, if you go into larger organizations, you'll see some AWS, some Azure, maybe even some Google, where cloud adoption hasn't been really governed and introduced into the organization very well. And it starts to create this kind of horrible problem where you then have to consolidate these clouds or join them. So I guess my first point would be, if you're going to migrate to the cloud, and this resonates with everything Lawrence has said, really, it's the organization that moves to the cloud. It's not IT. It's not a technical problem, and you need an organization-wide project to do that. And that's to help answer a lot of the questions, but also to get stakeholders on board with that move. And everybody needs to start to think just a little bit differently. Otherwise, you're destined to fail. And I've seen organizations that are on a second and a third and a fourth attempt at migrating to the cloud. So what could you do to make this more likely to succeed? So I think everybody, particularly around an IT world, is very au fait nowadays with Agile, but you don't want to move to the cloud in an Agile way. You want to build a platform. You know, you wouldn't build a house using Agile. You'd be painting rooms while the foundations were setting. So you want to really think about building a cloud platform before you start to adopt it. Build your foundation first. And that brings in some boring things that unfortunately you have to think about. So one of those would be a cloud operating model. So what's your business strategy? How are you going to govern this? What's your appetite for risk? What people do you have, and how are they going to work with this cloud? And it's not something I'm going to go into a lot of detail about, but if you in Azure world, have a look on the Microsoft website. There's some really good documentation on this. But you need to think about how your organization is going to work in the cloud. And then where I tend to go into organizations is kind of an architectural level and looking at the vision for how this cloud platform is going to work. So looking at governance, quality attributes, so the ilities, as we talk about them. And suddenly things start to get a bit harder. I always think of an architectural view like a dice or a Rubik's Cube. And what you can do is turn it and look at different views, but actually all those views are interconnected. And from a cloud point of view, I tend to come at it from 3 different views. So a logical view. So what's the structure of the organization and how would that be reflected in the cloud? A physical view. So what kind of resources do you need to create? Where are you going to create them and how are you going to link them all together? And then your operational view. So actually, how are you going to keep these things running and running well once they are up in the cloud? And not surprising support at the very last minute with, ta-da, we've got a new cloud platform for you. So if we take each of those in turn, so from a logical point of view, very first question is, who's going to own this cloud platform? And it usually falls to a CTO or an IT director to kind of put their name on the line, but it's usually a ceremonial position and it immediately gets handed off into IT. But that's where we start to establish our security at the very, very top level. And then we get into the question of who's going to pay for it. And we need a way to establish how we can pay for it. And we need a way of grouping and setting up structure that enables us to do that. But this is where, when we turn the dice, actually, we're relating this to the physical resources we're going to deploy. So we need a view of what we're going to deploy into the cloud and where we're going to deploy it, and it all becomes kind of joined up. But from a logical grouping point of view, we've got a couple of tools in Azure in particular that can really help us. And they give us a sense for the structure of the organization and start to introduce some governance. So one is subscriptions. So we can set security at subscription level. We can establish subscriptions based on environment. So we might have a dev and a UAT and a live subscription, or we might do that by clients. So maybe each individual client has their own specific area and we can set security to allow them in. And then under a subscription, we've got resource groups. So we can start to gather up aspects of a solution into a contained unit. And this gives us the ability to view and price and understand, manage at that level. And it really needs a lot of thinking about upfront, because when you start to deploy resources into these logical structure, they're not fixed, but it becomes a lot harder to move them around. And that kind of brings us into one of my bugbears. So I'm a big fan of naming conventions. So when we think of a logical structure, what you want to do is try and remove as much tacit knowledge from people as possible. So ideally, they can go to the portal and they can understand just by looking at the names of subscriptions and resource groups, and then ideally down into the resources, what they're dealing with. So, you know, if it's got the word live in it, they know they probably shouldn't just reboot that during the middle of the day. This helps people a lot, and that you can need to bake that into your logical structure from day one. And I've kind of mentioned this before. So once we started to build our logical structure, that gives us the ability to introduce security. So we've got our top level owner, we can then have subscriptions, and we can introduce security at that level. So we can provide developers with full access in the dev environment and restrict that in live, for example, and then even at the resource group level. So do we want developers maybe to have some access in some environments, or do we want to bring third parties in? Because actually we're going to have third party companies who are developing solutions for us. Maybe they need to maintain that in live, but we don't want to give them access to everything. So our logical structure, our subscriptions, our resource groups, give us that ability to actually establish our security and our governance at that level. So this is kind of one view from the dice. And once we started to think about that, that gives us a bit more scope to then turn the dice a bit further and start to look at the physical deployment. So what resources we're going to deploy. And I usually start at connectivity. So we've got a cloud up in the sky or in London or wherever it is. Is that cloud for our colleagues and our co-workers, or is it for our customers? And it's a good question to answer early, because that tends to dictate where you're going to deploy to. So you wouldn't deploy into the US if all of your customers are based in the UK. So we start to drive into the latency and where we want to put our resources within our logical structure. So questions there will be, where are our customers, where are our colleagues based? Do we have office workers? Do we have home workers? And then this starts to drive out things like, do we need an express route from our office to have a dedicated physical connection? Because that's something that takes a long time to establish. Or do we want to support, say, working from home, which is quite a big thing nowadays, but secure working from home through VPN connections? And we start to establish these security boundaries. And also, as part of connectivity, are we entirely public? Are we entirely private? We may be integrating with business-to-business clients through a heavyweight integration and dedicated networking. Or maybe in a lot of cases, we have a kind of more of a hybrid view. So we've got a public component to our cloud, and then a back office private component, and how to establish that relationship between the public and the private within our cloud. So there's quite a lot to think about around connectivity, and there's a couple of patterns that can help with that. So one is hub and spoke, where you can centralize connectivity, and there are lots of tools in Azure to do this. But if you think about them after the fact, when you've deployed, it gets a lot more difficult to do. And obviously with our connectivity, we're thinking about security up front. So we've talked about express route and VPN. But from a security around our resources point of view, are we creating virtual machines? Do we need to manage passwords? Would we like to domain join these virtual machines? Are we deploying web applications? Are we deploying web APIs? Do we need web application firewalls? Do we need to worry about cross-site scripting, SQL injection? So we're starting to identify physical resources that we might put on those security boundaries to actually protect our information. And then internally, this is something Lawrence was talking about before, we can separate out our resources through VNets and subnets. In Azure, you've got private endpoints and service endpoints. So we're thinking about how our individual services connect together to make sure we've got that nice, secure communication environment. And all of these things have a potentially huge bearing on cost. Typically, the more secure you want to be, the more expensive it is, unfortunately. And we can kind of start to think about resources and risk. So this isn't risk around security. This is where we're thinking about, hey, it just scales up for free, or Microsoft handle that. So Microsoft don't really handle resilience, reliability, recovery. They give you tools to do those things. So if you work on the theory that there will always be issues that you need to recover from, so questions like, how much data can you afford to lose? Or how sensitive is your data? Or as a business, how much downtime can you sustain if your website's down from customers? And then that starts to drive that appetite for risk that you have. So as a business, you might say, you know, it's fine if we're down for a few days, or you might say, we need to be running basically all the time. And then this makes you think about different deployment options. So actually maybe deploying to a single region within your cloud platform is fine. So a single region, maybe UK South, has 3 data centers, we could put a single instance into one of those data centers, and that's fine for us. Or maybe we need a bit more resilience. So what happens if that one instance goes down? So maybe we could then start to use availability zones and push out that single instance across the 3 data centers in that region. Or maybe actually we need to think about what happens if we lost a region, and it does happen sometimes. So maybe we need to have 2 regions, and maybe that's better for our customers as well. So we've got UK South and maybe going into Europe somewhere. But then how do we route traffic between those 2 regions? And do we need to think about geographic load balancers, something like front door? All of these things, when you think about them up front, what you're doing is you're taking away a lot of the pain from deploying solutions. Where Lawrence talked about you building the edge of the jigsaw, that's exactly what you're doing. You're building a cloud platform, and that cloud platform will enable you to deploy into it without having to worry about these questions every time you deploy. And then obviously the final area to be considered is always the operational side, because it's at the end of the chain. It's the people who have the worst life in any IT role, so into support. So we've managed to create our cloud platform, but we know that things might go down. So what do we need to monitor? And when we're monitoring things, who needs to know that there's a problem, and how we will let them know? So at this point, we're starting to think of things like when we start to put solutions up into our cloud platform, we can use Azure Monitor, we can gather information. Have we got on-premise solutions that maybe a journey starts on or finishes on, and we need a holistic view of what that journey looks like from on-premise into the cloud? So Azure Monitor will support things like that, assuming your connectivity is okay. And what dashboards and workbooks do we need to create so we've got a view of what's actually happening inside our cloud? We need to get familiar with log analytics so we can drive into details within the logs and understand what's happening. You have to find a reason to use App Insights because it's just amazing. But make sure you're using one instance of App Insights so everything is joined up and you can see your end-to-end flow through your system. And then look at putting alerting on for thresholds. So when you start to see CPUs increasing or systems going down, make sure the right people know. But the key thing really is that your support team is part of your organizational adoption of the cloud. So they understand the technology. They know they've got a good idea how to resolve issues. They also need to look at things like the SIEM tools within Azure. So this is Advisor, this is taking in security information and changes and understanding what needs to happen to fine tune Azure and to keep it running really well. So my second point really is it's the organization that needs to do all of this work up front to establish a cloud platform. And again, kind of going back to Lawrence's view on this is your jigsaw border. So once you've created your cloud platform, you've at least thought about it, everything becomes easier. So you know what to call things because we've established a really good naming convention, where to deploy them, how to deploy them, how to access them, who can access them, how to keep them running, and if all else fails, how to recreate them. But most importantly, you know the bill's going to get paid, so the lights are on and everything's going to keep running. So now we can start to build jigsaw pieces and we can deploy them up into our cloud platform. And it's simple, it's dead easy, it takes a lot of the complexity away from the teams that are doing this work because a lot of this platform has been put in place for us. But the key thing now is you need to get ready for everything to change. So I think Azure is 11 years old now, AWS is 15 years old. If you were to go back 11 or 15 years and look at what was available in the cloud, it looks nothing like today. It's absolutely unrecognizable. And I can guarantee you one thing, that this time in a month, it'll look a bit different again. And this time in 10 years, it will look hugely different. So you need to get ready to accept change and just become familiar with change and embrace change. And again, this is organizations that need to embrace change. So the cloud drives new opportunities. It creates new markets, particularly if you want to go global, because now you can start to pick up resources and cats and put them in a different geographic region near to new customers, and you can start to take this solution globally really easily. I think from an IT world, though, we're kind of used to change. So we've built our processes to be agile. It's based around change. We build our code to follow kind of solid principles, which is predominantly around baking in the ability to change. So we need to start to think about our cloud platforms in the same way as well. We need to bake change into the organization and continue to move forward and embrace that as well. Because you can guarantee that if you don't do it, your competitors will, and there'll be a startup that comes along that's disruptive, and all of a sudden you're on the back foot trying to catch up. So the first thing to change is, when you're adopting the cloud, is to adopt at the highest level you can of as a service. And that's usually software as a service, because the higher the stack you go, the lower the total cost of ownership is. You're managing less, you're maintaining less, and then of course you've got more time and more resources to add value. So I would always say aim for software as a service if you possibly can. And also, you need to greatly increase your ability to change through automation. So automation will give you repeatability, it will give you reliability. You've got better security, because in things like live environments, you're opening up to automation accounts as opposed to lots of developers. You've got audit trails of what's deployed. You're moving into a world of DevOps and ideally DevSecOps through build pipelines, deployment pipelines. So we're talking about technologies like ARM templates in Azure, if you're a masochist, Azure CLI or Terraform, if you want to be a bit more cloud independent. And you're starting to think as infrastructure as code. And I guess as an old geezer, one of the things I would say about being around the cloud for a while is you need to embrace change as an individual. So the world of IT is changing dramatically. I see developers writing far less code than I used to do. But what they do need to do is know more about infrastructure and have a holistic view of what they're deploying and where they're deploying it into. And infrastructure engineers, you're no longer physically connecting devices together anymore, but actually you need to know how to configure things and think about infrastructure as a code and scripting languages and development. So the two worlds are starting to blur more and more and more. And everybody needs to know about DevOps, and everybody needs to know about security. So I'd say as an individual, you need to be thinking, if you're in IT, what does the cloud mean for you? And are you progressing, and are you keeping up to date with cloud changes, and are you embracing change? So that's probably a huge whirlwind tour of how to take a multi-month project of adopting the cloud into about 15, 20 minutes. But I'm hoping it kind of gives you enough ammunition to go back to a business and say, we need to do this properly and build a cloud platform before we kind of move forward. And mainly think about all of these different challenges before we start to deploy our first solution. So our logical view, our physical view, our operational view, but basically embrace change as an organization and as an individual.
Brilliant. Cheers, Rick. I wanted to point everybody into the Q&A section. We've got 8 questions in there now. So obviously the more you vote and the questions you want answered first, the more thumbs up we get, the better. There is one, Richard, that I know we've spoken about in the past, and Lawrence and Guy, thanks for answering sort of on the chat function. But we've had a question, which is, there are a lot of businesses moving to AWS or GCP. Why do you think this is? And are people moving away from Azure? So, Richard, I know we've spoke about it in the past privately, but what's your sort of opinion on that?
I think people are a bit nomadic. I think people move around. I mean, the different cloud platforms have different capabilities. So Google is really good at some stuff. Azure is kind of quite mainstream and good at things. You know, Azure is, AWS is as well. And if you move for cost, you're shooting yourself in your foot, because the clouds are so competitive. For me, like Lauren said before, if you've got a team that's predominantly Microsoft based, you probably want to pick up Azure. It would be an easier entry in. I think Google, you're looking at very specific technologies. I don't think they're really competing with Azure or AWS on all fronts. But yeah, anything very specific that suits your needs. I've kind of found with AWS, the bar is higher for entry. I always think AWS works for larger organizations that have kind of dedicated teams. And for Azure, the entry is lower. The portal is great. You can kind of get into it right the way from bedroom programmer, but it supports right the way up to kind of SMEs and up into large-scale organizations. And I know that when you have people who come from AWS, kind of seasoned developers and architects that come from AWS, they actually find Azure quite liberating because you do have a view of what's in there. You can see a lot more, and there's a lot more that's immediately available to you. But I do think it does depend on what you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve. But I can guarantee you, if you've got 10 organizations leave AWS, there'll be 10 that are leaving Azure and 10 that are joining Google, and people are always up and down. The trend has been more and more people are joining Azure over the last few years.
Cool. No, that sounds perfect. Lawrence, I'm going to start the next question with yourself. This is the longest I've not heard you speak. I've known you. So it's on costing. So where do you start with costing? Is that from the business or from the customer?
From my perspective, I'll talk from my perspective. I have, a number of customers, and I know how much data I've got, and I know I can measure how much traffic there is. So once I get those kind of metrics, I start to look at, right, if I were to use these selection of services, and some of the Microsoft formula are somewhat entertaining. Go and play with the Azure calculator. It's hilarious. But you can get a feel for it and exactly how much you can start predicting how much over a 6 to 12 month period you can start working, right, okay, if I have 14 containers, if I suddenly burst up to 24 containers, how much is that going to change? What is my maximum going to be? And that can give you an idea, more of an idea of exactly how much you're going to work at. You need to get yourself a spreadsheet together and start looking at all those services that you want to use. Remember I talked about managing diversity? Yeah, you don't want your spreadsheet to be too complicated because it's too hard. But you do need to start using that spreadsheet to really drive down into number of people, number of transactions, amount of data, amount of transactions that you're moving through the platform. That really does. The question of do you ask the customers or do you ask the business? Well, what's the difference? It depends. If you're talking about a cloud environment for running a business as a client, the business is both of those things. For me, I looked at the data I've got to process, and then I worked out if I could afford it because I've got licenses. Then you got to look at, are you going to go transactionally based costing, or are you going to go per seat based costing, or are you going to look at asset priced costing? So how do you charge your customers if you're selling this as a software as a service to someone? And those things can change dramatically. You've got high asset cost but low transaction rates. You're not going to want to charge them by transaction. You're going to want to reverse that and look at asset based pricing. In other words, how much money are they putting through your system? You've also got, in my world, you've got the integrations. If you're integrating with other services and other providers and doing that sort of API ecosystem, you've got to really think about that, because you've got to not only cost the data going through it, but maintaining it and enabling and changing versions. People upgrade. And then you have to upgrade because they've upgraded because you're using their service and your customers are expecting that all to work. So there are different ways of looking there. Again, there's always variables. Richard was doing a good example of exactly how many variables there are. Track out those variables about the things that will impact the cost. And then you can start applying that to the use of the resources.
And I think what you said before, Lawrence, is exactly right. You look at one of the resources, so you deploy API management, for example, and you think that's great, and then you realize actually you need to scale up the security on that, and it's not a 10% change. So I think you need to understand what your security looks like and what your resilience looks like, so you can build that into your pricing up front. Otherwise, it can be a really horrible shock.
A good example of that is the DDoS protection within Azure, which there is DDoS protection as standard on anything, on any tenancy. But if you want to add and get your customers are demanding you add extra stuff, it's intensely expensive. And you've got to you've got to put 25, 50K in just for a line for that.
Brilliant. Cheers, guys. One from Garrad that I wanted to ask as well is, what have you found as the main reasons for initial failure to migrate? So, Richard, do you want to start off?
I think probably naivety, on behalf of the IT team and the organization. I do think I've seen so many projects where they've gone, hey, look, we've built all this, it's up in the cloud, and the business thinks that's it, it's done, it's ready, because they don't understand how it's deployed and where it's deployed. I think that happens all too often, and I think that's a bit of naivety on the IT team and the business. I think you wouldn't do that if you were building out a new office. You wouldn't go, look, it's there, there's no desks, there's no networking, there's no drinks machines, whatever it is. You walk around the office and go, yeah, it's done. And I think it's the same with the cloud. There's so many things that you need to have in there to make it into a platform that you can deploy into, that people don't realize.
That distinction of a platform, everybody thinks that it's just a bunch of applications inside Azure. No, Azure is a platform upon which you build another platform.
Right. I've got one here as well. Is it best to utilize and upskill your internal team or outsource the migration to a consultancy or third party? You could maybe add to that as well.
It depends where you want the IP. IP is incredibly important. Do you want to be beholden to a third party? You bring in a bunch of hotshots, they create your system that you've got to maintain going forward and then leave. Or you run out of money because they cost you a lot. You probably need to do a mixture, I would suggest. The way I've done it in variety of ways, I ensure that there's two things you don't outsource: analysis and, three: product, analysis, and architecture. Sorry, Richard. But you need that information, because if you don't have that, you lose power and you lose that IP. A bunch of programmers, a bunch of testers, yeah, outsource them, as long as they're following some very defined patterns. You do not want to give them free rein, because they will own you.
Rick, anything you'd like to add on that as well?
Yeah, I tend to work with people, Lawrence.
I'm just saying.
I know, that's fine. No, I mean, I completely agree. It depends if you want to build up your team to take something forwards, or if you're happy to have it done for you. And that's completely up to the business and the context around that. I mean, both are perfectly viable options. Me personally, I always think it's better to build up your team, because you've got the skills in-house to maintain that, and you're usually making your internal staff happier by giving them new opportunities. But then you also need to put the governance and the frameworks in around that to enable them to do that properly.
I actually, one of the things we did, we got an accelerator company in and we embedded them. So this wasn't just a set of individual independents. This was a specific company that with an aim to upskill as fast as possible the team inside and give them the skills to be able to take it forward.
I think it all depends as well in terms of the organisation you're in at that stage and how quick it has to be built as well. Yeah. So I think there's a number of factors to take consideration there when maybe looking at engaging a consultancy or a third party. But no, appreciate that. I've got one here. What are your top guiding principles for migration?
Richard, do you want to?
Mine would be don't lift and shift. I think that would be my top one. I think I would evaluate what it is that you want to migrate up into the cloud, and I guess understand things like your timescales and your appetite for making changes and how easy it is to do. But I would always try and target a solution in the cloud as opposed to just lift and shift something.
Yeah. as I said, I have 10 sort of principles, and you've got to consider, they're things such as consider the customer. Who is it you're building for? So make sure that you're building not for a bunch of techies, but for somebody who's going to use this thing. The management of technical diversity is very important, but also speed to value. You know, if you build your pipelines right, you need to get a change out there very quickly. If you don't build those pipelines right, it'll still take you too long. So there's a whole set of things there that you need to really think about. And having that set of guiding principles allows you to create the patterns with which you're going to build this thing, because there's a lot in there and you need those patterns.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. Another one for you. Can you shed some more light on cloud agnostic, please?
I think it's always a bit of a utopian dream that you can just deploy in Azure, and then you fed up with Azure and move to AWS. It doesn't always work that well. I think you'd have to have a really good reason to be cloud agnostic to start with, but I think a lot of the principles are still the same. And you start to see more and more technologies that enable you to become cloud agnostic. So for example, if you're building containers to house your solutions, in theory, you can deploy your container to any cloud then. If you're deploying using Terraform, then in theory, you notice I caveat a lot of stuff with in theory. In theory, you can use Terraform to deploy into any cloud. So you can start to be more agnostic. But then if you're using Azure Monitor for logging, for example, then you're starting to tie yourself in just a bit. And if you're thinking about subscriptions and resource groups, then you're starting to tie yourself in just a bit. So I always think it's this utopian dream that I wouldn't try to achieve. I'd try to make your solutions as portable as possible.
I've always, sort of the genericity versus specificity is interesting. Genericity costs so much more in reality. The example I give to people is the Space Shuttle versus the Apollo mission. The Apollo mission did one thing really, really well. It got to the moon. That was its only need to do, and that's all it was geared to do. The Space Shuttle cost immensely more because it was generic. And the idea was to repeat over and over again. And NASA ended up getting rid of it because it was too expensive to be that generic. You've got to work out what your balance is. Personally, I wanted to use things like API management, which is great in Azure. And, you know, because I needed to have that ability to open my APIs up. So I'm tying myself in because I wanted to use that specific tool. But yeah, so Docker is a fantastic technology, and make use of it, really do. But know that it costs money, and there is costs associated with it within the various platforms.
Great, thank you. Main features on Azure that you can't do without?
App Insights. Just for the amazing diagrams, if nothing else. It is such an amazing tool. I can't tell you how good it is and how many times it's saved teams that I've been working with bacon, because it just gives you such a great understanding of what's happening. Just amazing.
Yeah, I'd agree.
What else other than that? What would you say?
For me, most of my customers want to integrate with Office. And the Office 365, which I hated when it came out, and I just disliked, and I wanted to use Google Docs more and more. But the Office suite is brilliant, and I need to open up. It opens up so many avenues, especially to do with single sign-on, and especially with. So, for instance, one of our plans is to hook up the various ADs and allow the customer, so I can get rid of the having them to write user profiles and user you know, user roles and security roles. I'm just going to go with AD. It's so much easier.
Yeah, it's one of the things when we talked about kind of people moving clouds, it's another one of the comments that people who move from AWS into Azure make is the Active Directory and security that you have access to. Because they've done an amazing job at taking an on-premise Active Directory into the cloud, but then just rolling that through Azure and through single sign-on into other applications is brilliant. It really is.
And for me, hooking up with other organizations' ADs and allowing them in, that security is brilliant.
Great. Next one, biggest mistakes.
My team decided to put the tenancy in mutualvision.co.uk for a SaaS-based system. Luckily, I caught it. It was like, I'm sorry, what are you doing? You want to ensure that and that's why I emphasize tenancy and designing that tenancy. Don't just dump it all in one place.
I'm trying to think, to be honest. I try not to touch anything where I can make a mistake. I tend to try and draw diagrams and write documents. It's much easier. It's much safer.
Is there a mistake that you've maybe seen, Richard, that an organisation's been implementing that you've seen and you thought, what is happening here?
Yeah, I mean, the usual big mistake where you kind of, you do an intake of breath is that people don't realise that when you're creating things in a cloud, they're usually public on the internet. They don't kind of realise that. So, oh, great, I've got a new VM and it's up there. And people like to try and hack things in Azure because they know, where they are. They know what RDP ports are because it's always the same. SSH ports are. So they'll just immediately start to batter it and try and get in. And it goes back to kind of thinking about your security up front and how you want to deploy this stuff. But yeah, the usual one is you go into an organization and look at what they've got and you kind of go, we probably want to make some quick changes here.
One of the things in that area I've seen is serverless functions, which are brilliant. Love them, be it in AWS or Microsoft, but they're just open. Anybody can try and run them. You do not want that.
Great. I think we've got time for one more, which is so the final question is what do you need? What do you not need to automate? So what do you not need to automate?
I have a rule. If you do something once, that's fine. If you do it twice, automate it. Because if you do it twice, you're going to do it a third time and a fourth time. So in a way, you can't afford to not automate anything. You have to automate everything you want to.
Yeah, I mean,
you're going to do it multiple times.
I'd agree with that, and I think one of the things, particularly because I move around a lot, I think one of the things I never try to do is have tacit knowledge that I'm taking out of a business. It's in my head only, and you're either doing one of two things: you're writing it down to become stale, and people won't update it or don't know it exists, or you put it into some kind of process that's automated, in which case everybody knows it's there and it can be understood and changed. So I'm a big fan of trying to automate everything.
Great. Well, gentlemen, that's sort of the end of the Q&A. So what I wanted to sort of say, obviously, it's you can't see everybody here, but I'm sure everybody's given a sort of virtual round of applause. So, thank you, Richard and Lawrence, for your contribution. Really appreciate it, guys. What we're going to also do is release these in sections. So the initial chat from Lawrence, the initial chat from Rich, and the Q&A, and that's going to go onto Spotify and YouTube as well. So if there's people that couldn't attend, we can get that sent out as well. If anybody's got any feedback as well, really appreciate it. But yeah, I want to say a big thank you, guys. Appreciate you sort of taking the time out of your busy schedules and upskilling. I've definitely found it useful. I'm sure everybody else has. But yeah, no, thank you very much.